April 1956. The iron gates of the Eddystone plant slammed shut, silencing a mechanical leviathan that had breathed fire for half a century. As the heavy locks turned, thousands of men walked away, their soot-stained faces looking back at 600 acres of suddenly lifeless steel. The mighty heartbeat of American steam had flatlined. Decades prior, this was no mere factory. It was a sprawling, self-sustaining kingdom. At its zenith, 20,000 workers labored in its fiery belly, forging over 70,000 locomotives that conquered untamed frontiers and stitched continents together. When two world wars plunged the globe into darkness, this very soil birthed thousands of Sherman and Patton tanks, acting as a relentless arsenal of democracy. Its foundries burned with a fierce ambition that seemed to challenge the sun itself. Now that empire is ash. The deafening symphony of forging hammers and hissing steam has been swallowed by the hollow wind howling over rusted scrap. A city of livelihoods evaporated into nothingness. How does an undisputed titan of such colossal power, the very engine of the modern world, simply vanish? It wasn't a sudden economic crash. It wasn't foreign sabotage. The beast was devoured from within by a singular, blinding hubris. This is the saga of Baldwin's Eddystone. Step into the ruins of an industrial titan to witness a profound tale of towering ambition, tragic pride, and the devastating cost of a king refusing to change his crown. Long before the silence claimed the Delaware River, there was a deafening roar in the heart of Philadelphia. By the turn of the 20th century, the Baldwin Locomotive Works was not merely a company. It was a reigning monarch of the industrial age. Yet, this undisputed king of steam was slowly being suffocated by the very kingdom it helped build. For decades, Baldwin's sprawling Broad Street complex had been a marvel of manufacturing. It was a dense, pulsating labyrinth of brick and iron right in the middle of a rapidly modernizing metropolis. But success has a peculiar way of becoming a cage. As the American frontier expanded and global trade exploded, the world did not just want more locomotives, it demanded larger, heavier, and infinitely more powerful machines. The era of quaint, wood-burning engines had passed, giving way to fire-breathing leviathans made of solid steel. The Broad Street facility, however, could not stretch. It was landlocked by the encroaching city, trapped in a grid of narrow streets, civic buildings, and residential neighborhoods. The situation bordered on the absurd. To move a completed locomotive out of the factory, workers often had to halt city traffic, navigating multi-ton behemoths through tightly packed intersections. The ground of Philadelphia trembled daily beneath the weight of progress, and the sky was perpetually choked with the thick, acrid smoke of the foundries. The citizens, though proud of their industrial titan, were growing tired of sweeping soot from their pristine porches. Baldwin had become a giant forced to live in a closet. The leadership of Baldwin, driven by the relentless and visionary energy of men like Samuel Vauquelin, recognized a terrifying truth. To stand still in the age of industry was to die. They could not continue to build the future's iron arteries in a facility that belonged to the past. The company needed space, not just to breathe, but to conquer. They required a blank canvas vast enough to hold ambitions that bordered on the mythical. The search for a new home led them away from the claustrophobic avenues of Philadelphia and down the Delaware River. What they found, approximately 13 miles to the south, was not a glittering industrial park, but a desolate, marshy expanse known as Eddystone. It was 600 acres of damp, unpromising earth, heavily burdened by tidal mud and wild overgrowth. To the untrained eye, it was a wasteland. To the visionaries at Baldwin, it was paradise. The proposal to purchase and develop Eddystone was a masterclass in industrial audacity. It was not simply a matter of erecting a few new warehouses. The plan called for the creation of an entirely new, self-sustaining world. It meant uprooting an established workforce, tearing up decades of operational history, and pouring an astronomical fortune into a swamp. The financial risk was staggering. If the ground could not support the colossal weight of the heavy machinery, or if the logistics of moving operations paralyzed their production schedule, the undisputed king of steam could bankrupt itself before a single engine rolled out of the new gates. There was also a profound emotional toll to the decision. Leaving Broad Street meant abandoning the sacred ground where Matthias Baldwin had built his very first locomotive, Old Ironsides, back in 1832. It was a severing of roots, a high-stakes gamble that traded a comfortable, proven history for a wild, muddy frontier. Yet the ambition of the era demanded sacrifice. The boardroom debates were fierce, but the writing on the wall was clear. The locomotives of tomorrow could not be born in the confines of yesterday. With a mixture of calculated brilliance and sheer, stubborn willpower, the decision was finalized. Baldwin would move. They would conquer the mud of Eddystone just as their engines had conquered the Rocky Mountains. They would not just build a factory, they would engineer a mechanized city-state, a monument to human labor and iron that would dwarf anything the world had ever seen. As the first shovel struck the soft, marshy earth of the Delaware riverbank, the die was cast. The great migration from the cramped heart of Philadelphia to the sprawling shores of Eddystone began. It was the birth of an empire, a monumental undertaking driven by the belief that human hands, armed with enough capital and ambition, could bend geography itself to the will of industry. The ground was being laid for a golden age, setting the stage for a mechanical symphony that would echo across the globe. The transformation of Eddystone from a silent, waterlogged marsh into the undisputed capital of global locomotive manufacturing did not happen overnight. It was a grueling, decades-long campaign against nature itself. Beginning in the early 1900s, the Baldwin Locomotive Works unleashed an army of engineers and laborers upon the shores of the Delaware River. Their mission was not merely to erect buildings, but to terraform the earth to bear the unimaginable weight of heavy industry. Thousands of wooden pilings were driven deep into the thick mud to reach bedrock, creating a subterranean foundation strong enough to support the massive drop forges and iron foundries that would soon follow. As the skeletal steel frames of the new buildings pierced the skyline, the sheer, staggering scale of the Eddystone blueprint became visible. This was not a factory. It was a sovereign industrial city-state. Spanning over 600 acres, the complex was meticulously designed to be an entirely self-sustaining ecosystem. The sprawling site was eventually woven together by nearly 30 miles of internal railway tracks, a complex nervous system of standard and narrow-gauge lines that transported raw materials, giant boiler plates, and partially assembled engines between dozens of specialized shops. Every geographical feature of the land was weaponized for maximum efficiency. The Delaware River was no longer just a scenic boundary, it was transformed into a global shipping artery. Baldwin constructed massive deep-water docks equipped with towering cranes, allowing ocean-going freighters to pull up directly to the factory's edge. This meant a locomotive could be tested on the Eddystone tracks in the morning and loaded directly into the hull of a ship bound for South America or Europe by nightfall. Inside the walls, the architecture was cavernous. The erecting shops were so unimaginably vast, stretching for fractions of a mile, that foremen and supervisors famously relied on bicycles to navigate the factory floor. Overhead, colossal bridge cranes glided along steel tracks, effortlessly lifting 80-ton boilers as if they were hollow toys. The central power plant, a towering structure billowing thick black smoke, generated enough electricity and compressed air to power a small metropolis. By the 1920s, The painful, agonizing transition from the claustrophobic Broad Street plant was complete. The gamble had paid off. Baldwin had successfully transplanted its beating heart into a body uniquely designed to dominate the 20th century. The infrastructure was in place. The Leviathan's lair was built. All it needed now was the relentless, driving force of human labor to awaken the beast. When the great whistles of Eddystone shrieked at the break of dawn, they summoned an army. The workforce swelled into the tens of thousands, transforming the surrounding Delaware County into a bustling hive of working-class neighborhoods. Generations of families, immigrants seeking the American dream, seasoned machinists and raw laborers, poured through the iron gates day after day. They were the blood in the factory's veins, feeding an insatiable hunger for production. The rhythm of Eddystone was a symphony of deafening violence. Inside the foundries, the temperature regularly soared past 120 degrees. Men wrapped in heavy protective leather danced around crucibles of molten iron, their faces illuminated by the demonic orange glow of liquid metal. Giant steam hammers, dropping with the force of small earthquakes, slammed into glowing ingots of steel, shaping the colossal driving rods that would propel the world's trains. The air was perpetually thick with the taste of sulfur, the sharp tang of ozone from early welding torches, and the ubiquitous, choking dust of coal and sand. Yet beneath this raw, violent display of brute force lay a demand for microscopic precision. A steam locomotive was a heavy-duty titan, but its internal valves, pistons, and cylinders required the delicate, exact tolerances of a Swiss watch. If a single boiler rivet was compromised, or a piston ring milled a fraction of an inch too wide, the resulting explosion could tear the machine, and the men around it, to pieces. Managing this duality of colossal scale and millimeter precision was the true genius of the Eddystone workforce. During the golden age of steam, the output was staggering. Locomotives rolled out of the erecting shops in a seemingly endless procession. Baldwin was not just supplying the Pennsylvania Railroad or the Santa Fe. They were equipping the world. Eddystone engines climbed the treacherous, thin-aired passes of the Andes in Chile, crossed the frozen steppes of Imperial Russia, and hauled freight across the deserts of Egypt. They were the undisputed mechanical marvels of their time, custom-built beasts tailored to the exact specifications of any gauge, climate, or terrain on Earth. However, this relentless pace harbored a hidden, grinding tension. The logistics of feeding the Eddystone machine were a daily tightrope walk. Millions of pounds of raw iron ore, coal, and lumber had to arrive with perfect timing. If the brass foundry fell behind by a few hours, the massive erecting shops ground to a halt, costing the company fortunes in idle labor. The pressure on the floor supervisors to maintain the flow of production was absolute and unforgiving. For a time, the system held perfectly. Eddystone was a marvel of the modern world, a flawless engine of capitalism and engineering. As the 1930s approached, the men of Baldwin looked out over their 600-acre domain of fire and steam, confident that their reign would last forever. They were the kings of the rails, entirely unaware that the darkest, most demanding trials of human history were looming just over the horizon, ready to push the great factory to its absolute, breaking limit. The sprawling complex of Eddystone had barely settled into its rhythm as the world's premier locomotive manufacturer when the geopolitical foundations of the globe fractured. In the summer of 1914, Europe descended into the unprecedented carnage of the First World War. The conflict quickly devolved into a grueling war of attrition, demanding logistical supply lines and munitions on a scale humanity had never witnessed. The combatant nations looked across the Atlantic for an industrial savior, and the colossal, fire-breathing foundries of Baldwin's Eddystone were uniquely positioned to answer the call. Almost overnight, the mission of the great plant shifted from connecting cities to arming empires. The company did not merely increase its locomotive production, it radically diversified its manufacturing base to feed the insatiable hunger of the Western Front. Recognizing the desperate need for infantry weapons, Baldwin constructed a massive auxiliary facility on the Eddystone grounds, the Eddystone Rifle Plant. Operated in conjunction with Remington Arms, this colossal sub-factory became the largest rifle manufacturing plant in the world. At its peak, the facility was churning out up to 6,000 M1917 Enfield rifles every single day. By the war's end, nearly 2 million rifles had been produced on Baldwin soil, arming the vast majority of the American Expeditionary Forces. But the transformation did not stop at small arms. The heavy hydraulic presses and giant drop forges that had previously shaped driving wheels and axles were recalibrated for a far more destructive purpose. Eddystone began producing millions of artillery shells, transforming raw steel into high-explosive ordnance, destined for the trenches of France and Belgium. The factory floor became a chaotic, deafening landscape where the sharp, metallic clatter of rifle assembly lines competed with the ground-shaking thunder of heavy munitions forging. Amidst the production of weapons, Baldwin's core competency remained critical to the war effort. The muddy, cratered battlefields of Europe required robust, reliable transportation to move troops and supplies to the front lines. To meet this demand, Eddystone engineers designed and mass-produced the Pershing locomotives, rugged, specialized steam engines built specifically for the grueling conditions of military railways in France. These iron beasts were rapidly assembled, loaded onto transport ships at the Eddystone docks, and sent directly into the theater of war. This period of explosive wartime expansion injected an unprecedented surge of capital into the Baldwin locomotive works. The government contracts were massive, guaranteed, and seemingly endless. The workforce swelled dramatically, operating in frantic, around-the-clock shifts. However, this staggering success carried a hidden psychological poison. The sheer volume of output and the immense profits generated during the Great War created a dangerous illusion of invincibility within the Baldwin boardroom. The executives looked at their roaring furnaces and their sprawling 600-acre empire and began to equate sheer industrial mass with permanent supremacy. The sudden flood of wartime money insulated the company from the normal, brutal forces of market competition, planting the early, invisible seeds of complacency that would eventually prove fatal. The illusion of eternal dominance was severely tested during the Great Depression, which brought railway orders to a devastating halt, yet the sheer size of Baldwin allowed it to weather the storm. But just as the company was stabilizing, the world was plunged into darkness once again. The outbreak of the Second World War demanded an industrial mobilization that dwarfed even the staggering efforts of the previous conflict. Once more, the United States government turned to the proven titan of Eddystone. This time, the nature of mechanized warfare had evolved, and Baldwin adapted with breathtaking speed. The heavy erecting shops, built to hoist 80-ton boilers, were perfectly suited for the assembly of heavy armor. Eddystone transformed into a vital artery in the arsenal of democracy, rapidly pivoting to the production of combat tanks. The factory floors that had birthed steam locomotives now rang with the sound of armor plating being riveted and welded for the M3 Lee and the iconic M4 Sherman tanks. As the war progressed, Baldwin took on even heavier projects, casting massive hulls for the M6 heavy tank and producing vital components for the advancing Patton tank series. The scope of Baldwin's World War II production was a testament to extreme engineering. Beyond tanks, the facility manufactured massive ship propellers for the U.S. Navy, heavy naval gun mounts, and specialized railway artillery. The workforce transformed again, this time integrating thousands of women who stepped onto the heavy factory floors to operate cranes, weld tank treads, and inspect munitions, keeping the Leviathan running while the men fought overseas. The patriotic fervor within Eddystone was absolute. Every worker knew that the steel they poured directly contributed to the survival of the free world. Yet beneath the roaring success of this wartime production lay a catastrophic, strategic trap. The U.S. military logistics network relied heavily on established, reliable technology to move millions of tons of domestic freight to the coasts. Consequently, the War Production Board ordered Baldwin to do what it did best: mass-produce standard steam locomotives. While this mandate was critical for the immediate war effort, it effectively forced Baldwin to double down on an aging technology. All civilian research and development was frozen. The brilliant engineering minds at Eddystone were entirely consumed by the demands of producing tanks, shells, and wartime steam engines. They had no time, no resources, and no government permission to experiment with alternative forms of propulsion. Meanwhile, away from the heavy demands of military steam production, a rival was quietly altering the future. General Motors, through its Locomotive division, had already begun perfecting diesel-electric technology before the war. While Baldwin was locked into producing the heavy, maintenance-intensive steam engines required by the military, the diesel engine was being refined into a highly efficient, labor-saving machine. When the Axis powers finally surrendered and the massive government contracts evaporated overnight, Baldwin awoke to a terrifying new reality. Their triumphant performance in the Second World War had been a brilliant, blinding flash of light that perfectly masked their technological stagnation. They emerged from the conflict as the absolute masters of a dying art, completely unprepared for the silent, efficient revolution that was about to render their fiery empire obsolete. When the smoke of the Second World War finally cleared, the Baldwin Locomotive Works stood atop an industrial mountain of its own making. The Eddystone facility was operating at a staggering capacity, its massive foundries still glowing with the heat of wartime production and a massive backlog of domestic orders. The world was rebuilding, and the executives in Philadelphia believed that the rebuilding would be powered, as it always had been, by the violent, magnificent force of steam. They were the undisputed masters of the firebox, the boiler, and the driving rod. In their eyes, the steam locomotive was not merely a product. It was the ultimate, perfected expression of human engineering. Yet, while Baldwin was deafened by the roar of its own success, a quieter, far more insidious revolution was taking place in the American Midwest. General Motors, through its Locomotive division, EMD, had spent the war years perfecting a radically different kind of motive power, the diesel-electric locomotive. To the seasoned veterans of Eddystone, the diesel engine was an object of derision. It lacked the visceral, breathing soul of a steam engine. A steam locomotive was a custom-tailored behemoth. Railroads would send their chief engineers to Eddystone to dictate every minute specification, from the diameter of the driving wheels to the exact placement of the brass trim. Every steam engine was a unique work of art, a massive, labor-intensive beast that required a dedicated crew to feed it coal, monitor its water levels, and constantly maintain its intricate external moving parts. The diesel, by contrast, was a sterile, standardized box. It was essentially a power plant on wheels, a diesel engine turning a generator, which in turn powered electric traction motors on the axles. It didn't roar, it hummed. It didn't require a fireman to shovel coal or an ash pit to clean its underbelly. Most offensively to the traditionalists at Baldwin, General Motors did not custom build them. They treated locomotives like automobiles. They offered a catalog of standardized models, mass-produced on an assembly line with interchangeable parts. This conceptual clash created a fatal, blinding hubris within the Baldwin boardroom. The leadership, men who had spent their entire lives mastering the metallurgy of high-pressure steam, simply could not and would not, fathom that a glorified generator could ever replace the raw, tractive effort of a heavy steam engine. They publicly dismissed diesels as a passing fad, suitable perhaps for lightweight passenger trains or small switching yards, but entirely incapable of hauling heavy freight over steep mountain grades. "They will never replace steam" became the unspoken, rigid dogma of the company. It was a failure of imagination rooted in immense pride. Baldwin's leadership fell into the classic trap of the incumbent giant. They defined their business by the specific product they made rather than the problem they solved. They believed they were in the business of building steam locomotives, failing to realize that their customers were simply in the business of moving freight as cheaply and efficiently as possible. This arrogant devotion to their legacy blinded them to the reality that the very definition of power was changing. The stubborn refusal to accept the changing tide might have been sustainable in a vacuum, but the post-war American economy was unforgiving. The railroads, facing increasing competition from the rapidly expanding highway system and the commercial airline industry, were under massive pressure to cut operational costs. And when the railroad accountants began to run the numbers, the romance of steam evaporated in the face of brutal, undeniable mathematics. The economic advantage of the diesel-electric locomotive was absolute. A steam engine, for all its majesty, was horrifyingly inefficient. It spent hours every day out of service, taking on water, loading coal, dumping ash, and undergoing constant preventative maintenance. It required a vast, expensive infrastructure of water towers, coaling stations, and specialized roundhouses spaced every 100 miles along a route. A diesel, on the other hand, could run from Chicago to Los Angeles, with only brief stops to refuel. It was ready to pull a train at the push of a button, required only a single engineer to operate, and eliminated the need for the massive support infrastructure that steam demanded. General Motors capitalized on this by offering railroads a revolutionary proposition: standardized parts that could be easily swapped out, drastically reducing repair times and keeping the engines on the tracks generating revenue. The tipping point arrived when even Baldwin's most loyal and steadfast customers began to defect. The Pennsylvania Railroad, whose headquarters were just miles away from Eddystone and who had purchased thousands of Baldwin steam engines over a century, began placing massive, multi-million-dollar orders for GM diesels. It was a crushing, unmistakable signal. The market had spoken, and it had chosen efficiency over tradition. The panic that finally gripped the Eddystone boardroom was absolute. The realization that they had squandered critical years of research and development crashed down upon the executives. They were the masters of mechanical engineering, but diesel-electric technology required deep expertise in internal combustion and complex electrical systems, areas where Baldwin's institutional knowledge was dangerously thin. They had essentially brought a hammer to a surgical operation. In a desperate, frantic scramble to pivot, Baldwin ordered its engineers to design and build road diesels to compete with GM. But the damage of their delay was already profound. They were years behind in testing, entirely lacking the standardized manufacturing processes that made EMD so profitable. Worse still, the stubborn culture of Eddystone bled into their new designs. Instead of adopting the assembly line standardization of General Motors, Baldwin treated their early diesels like steam engines, customizing them for different buyers, using a dizzying array of non-standard electrical components and creating a logistical nightmare for the railroads trying to maintain them. The transition was clumsy, reactive, and agonizing. The undisputed kings of the rails had suddenly become desperate followers, scrambling in the dark to catch a train that had already left the station. The fortress of Eddystone was intact, but its soul was critically wounded. The immense foundries of Eddystone, once the undisputed anvil of the gods where modern civilization was forged, now felt like a sprawling industrial mausoleum. By the dawn of the 1950s, the deafening roar of production that had defined Baldwin for over a century began to ring hollow. The executives in Philadelphia could no longer ignore the brutal reality echoing across the continent. The era of steam was not merely fading, it was being violently executed by the sleek, standardized efficiency of the diesel-electric locomotive. Panic, a cold and unfamiliar visitor to the mahogany halls of the great Titan, finally set in. But instead of a calculated surgical transformation, Baldwin's reaction was the frantic, destructive thrashing of a wounded leviathan. They realized far too late that mastering the dark, exacting arts of internal combustion and intricate electrical circuitry could not be achieved overnight, regardless of how much capital they threw at the factory floor. They lacked the decades of specialized, quiet research that their rivals at General Motors had meticulously accumulated. Desperate for a lifeline, the leadership sought salvation not in innovation, but in sheer brute mass. In 1950, Baldwin brokered a monumental alliance that was intended to terrify the market into submission. They merged with the Lima-Hamilton Corporation, another legendary builder of steam locomotives facing the exact same existential dread. The resulting conglomerate, Baldwin-Lima-Hamilton, BLH, was heralded in the press as a colossal industrial counteroffensive. On paper, it was a behemoth. It combined massive manufacturing footprints, historic pedigrees, and a theoretical pooling of the greatest heavy engineering talent in the United States. Yet to the cynical observers on the factory floor and the sharp-eyed accountants of the major railroads, the BLH merger was a tragedy masquerading as a triumph. It was less a strategic partnership and more a desperate, suffocating embrace between two drowning empires. Tying two sinking ships together did not make them float. It simply ensured they would drag each other into the abyss much faster. The immediate consequence of the merger was absolute administrative and cultural chaos. The sprawling acreage of Eddystone was suddenly burdened with the bureaucratic bloat of integrating a distant workforce and incompatible corporate philosophies. Lima-Hamilton engineers, fiercely proud of their own heritage, clashed with the entrenched aristocratic mindset of the Baldwin veterans. Instead of a unified, streamlined offensive against General Motors, the newly formed BLH became a tangled knot of competing interests, redundant departments, and paralyzing internal politics. This internal bleeding quickly manifested in the very lifeblood of the company, the locomotives themselves. Desperate to maintain market share and prove the viability of their new alliance, BLH rushed their line of diesel electrics into production. What rolled out of the heavy erecting shops at Eddystone was, by all metrics of modern engineering, a mechanical tragedy. The BLH diesels were birthed from a fundamentally fractured design philosophy. Unable to produce reliable electrical transmission gear in-house, they relied heavily on external suppliers like Westinghouse. For the prime mover, the massive diesel engine itself, they utilized designs from WWII, an acquired subsidiary that specialized in heavy, slow-revving stationary engines used in ships and power plants, not the dynamic, high-stress, rapidly fluctuating environment of a moving locomotive. When these hastily engineered machines hit the rails, the results were catastrophic. The heavy WWII engines, while undeniably powerful, vibrated violently at high speeds, viciously shaking the locomotives and rattling loose critical internal components. Electrical fires in the Westinghouse gear became alarmingly common. Oil leaks persistently plagued the engine blocks. The mechanics in the railroad pits, men whose fathers and grandfathers had spoken of Baldwin steam engines with a hushed, almost religious reverence, now actively cursed the BLH nameplate. They spent agonizing hours deciphering chaotic wiring diagrams and fabricating makeshift brackets for vibrating, leaky power plants. The beautiful, terrifying symmetry of a steam locomotive had been replaced by a disjointed, clattering box of mismatched parts. The loss of prestige was palpable, hanging over the Eddystone plant like the thick, sulfurous smog of a dying era. Furthermore, the deep-seated Baldwin culture of custom building proved to be a fatal flaw. General Motors was succeeding because they offered absolute interchangeability. A mechanic in Chicago could swap a component on an EMD locomotive using the exact same manual and tools as a mechanic in Los Angeles. BLH, stubbornly clinging to its steam-era habits, continued to customize their diesels for individual railroads. They moved gauges, altered electrical setups, and changed body styles based on the passing whims of the buyer. While this flattered railroad executives at the point of sale, it created a logistical hell for the maintenance crews. When a BLH diesel broke down, which was often, procuring the exact custom-machined replacement part took weeks, leaving an expensive piece of capital idling uselessly in a rail yard. The humiliation was swift and public. The very railroads that had built their empires on the unbreakable backs of Baldwin steam engines began to treat the new BLH diesels as unreliable pariahs. They were relegated to minor branch lines or yard switching duties, kept far away from the prestigious, high-speed freight and passenger routes where true money was made. The final devastating blow came from their oldest and most faithful ally, the Pennsylvania Railroad. For over a century, the PRR and Baldwin had operated in a symbiotic lockstep, jointly dominating the industrial landscape of the American Northeast. But the PRR was bleeding capital in the post-war economy and could no longer afford the luxury of sentimentality. After testing the unreliable, maintenance-heavy BLH units, the executives of the PRR made the agonizing but necessary mathematical decision to pull their support. They diverted their massive fleet modernization budgets entirely to General Motors. When the news reached Eddystone, a profound, chilling silence fell over the executive offices. The mighty alliance had failed. The grand counteroffensive had collapsed under the weight of its own mechanical incompetence and arrogant assumptions. The giant was not just stumbling, it was actively cannibalizing its own legendary reputation. The fires in the great foundries still burned, but they were no longer forging the future. They were simply consuming the last reserves of an empire that had forgotten how to evolve. The vast erecting shops of Eddystone had always been a cathedral of noise, a place where the deafening roar of industry was a testament to American might. But by the early 1950s, a haunting acoustic shift had occurred. The thunderous cadence of the steam hammers was slowing down, replaced by long, echoing intervals of silence. The age of steam was in its death throes, and the floor of the Baldwin plant had unwittingly become the stage for a grand industrial funeral. For decades, the creation of a steam locomotive had been an act of brutal artistry. The men who populated the heavy foundries and boiler shops were not merely factory workers, they were master artisans of heavy metallurgy. To watch a Baldwin boilermaker at work was to witness a lifetime of specialized, localized knowledge in action. These were men who could judge the exact temperature of a glowing steel rivet simply by its color, who understood the intricate physics of high-pressure steam through intuition and muscle memory. It was a trade passed down through generations, from fathers to sons, creating a localized aristocracy of labor within Delaware County. Now, those exact skills, honed over decades of sweat, burns, and relentless dedication, were being rendered instantly and completely worthless by the march of progress. The profound tragedy of Eddystone's decline was most visible in the eyes of these veteran mechanics. As the final orders for steam locomotives trickled in, mostly desperate, belated purchases from foreign markets such as India or smaller, stubbornly traditional domestic lines, the workers approached their tasks with a heavy, unspoken grief. They knew they were forging the ghosts of a dying world. When the massive overhead cranes lowered the final towering boilers onto their steel frames, there was no longer a sense of triumphant completion. Instead, there was the hollow dread of an impending end. In stark contrast to the majestic, breathing beasts they had spent their lives building, the new diesel-electric units being haphazardly assembled in the adjacent bays felt cold and alien. To the veteran steam mechanic, a diesel was a soulless appliance. It required electricians and parts swappers, not blacksmiths and boilermakers. The transition was not just a shift in manufacturing technique, it was a profound devaluation of human capital. A master riveter whose precise hammer strikes had once held together the very fabric of American commerce was suddenly an unskilled laborer in a world that demanded complex wiring schematics and high-tolerance generator maintenance. The tension between the factory floor and the executive offices grew venomous. Upstairs, in the quiet, mahogany-paneled boardrooms, the reality of the situation was stripped of all romance and reduced to cold, unforgiving mathematics. The charts detailing steam revenue were trapped in a terminal dive. The executives, desperate to stem the bleeding from their disastrous merger with Lima Hamilton, looked at the sprawling steam facilities not as hallowed ground, but as massive taxable liabilities. They could not afford sentimentality. The very physical scale of the steam operations, the massive casting pits, the colossal drop forges, the miles of specialized internal track, had become an economic anchor dragging the entire company down. The decision was made to ruthlessly amputate the dying limbs of the empire. The layoffs were merciless and sweeping. Foremen, fighting back tears and anger, were forced to hand pink slips to men they had worked beside for 30 years. The local taverns and diners around Eddystone, once vibrating with the boisterous energy of thousands of exhausted, well-paid workers at shift change, grew quiet and tense. Families that had relied on Baldwin paychecks for 3 generations suddenly found themselves staring into a terrifying abyss of unemployment. The company was shedding its most experienced, loyal personnel simply because the free market had stopped asking for the miracles they knew how to perform. When the final steam locomotive eventually rolled out of the Eddystone erecting shop, a magnificent, gleaming anachronism destined for a world that had already moved on, the event was profoundly muted. The great whistles of the factory, which had once shrieked in celebration of every major production milestone, remained stubbornly silent. The workers lined the tracks, soot-stained and quiet, wiping grease from their calloused hands as they watched the heavy driving wheels turn for the very last time. As the engine disappeared down the line, a chilling realization settled over the vast, cavernous buildings left in its wake. The fires in the heavy drop forges were allowed to burn out, and the ash was swept away. The heart of Baldwin, the primal, fiery furnace that had sustained a community and powered a nation, had stopped beating. The men walked back to their lockers, acutely aware that while the factory doors were technically still open, the true soul of Eddystone had just departed on those tracks, never to return. By the mid-1950s, the financial hemorrhage at Baldwin Lima Hamilton had escalated into a spectacular corporate crisis that was impossible to conceal. The sprawling Eddystone complex, once an untouchable fortress of American industry and a proud symbol of the nation's mechanical supremacy, was now widely viewed on Wall Street as a distressed, lumbering asset. It was a wounded, bleeding titan, thrashing helplessly in the shallow waters of a changing economy. The blood in the water naturally attracted predators, marking the beginning of a grim, humiliating new chapter. The fate of the historic factory was no longer guided by visionary engineers or master machinists, but by distant financiers wielding ledger books like butcher knives. Initially, the mighty Westinghouse Electric Corporation had stepped into the fray, acquiring a controlling interest with the vague, optimistic hope of marrying their undisputed electrical prowess to Baldwin's heavy manufacturing footprint. It was a theoretical lifeline that might have saved the diesel program. But even the executives at Westinghouse quickly recoiled when they confronted the sheer, unmanageable scale of Eddystone's inefficiencies and the deep-seated cultural resistance of its workforce. Recognizing a sinking ship laden with outdated machinery, Westinghouse quietly and swiftly divested, leaving the once proud locomotive builder adrift in a storm of debt. What happened next bordered on the absurd, injecting a dark, tragicomic irony into the great Baldwin saga. In an alliance that defied all mechanical and historic logic, the controlling shares of the undisputed king of steam were quietly purchased by the leadership of Armour and Company, a colossal Chicago-based meatpacking conglomerate. Men who had spent their entire professional careers calculating the fractional profit margins of slaughtered cattle, refrigerated boxcars, and canned ham were suddenly thrust into the mahogany boardrooms of a heavy industrial empire. To the seasoned machinists and proud boilermakers of Delaware County, the news was received with a mixture of stunned disbelief and bitter gallows humor. The hallowed foundries that had birthed the mighty engines that conquered the West and won the Second World War were now, for all practical purposes, being overseen by corporate butchers. The profound, almost mythical reverence for metallurgy, high-pressure steam, and heavy steel that had defined the Baldwin ethos for over a century meant absolutely nothing to the new regime. Armour's executives did not look at Eddystone and see a cathedral of engineering. They looked at the sprawling 600 acres, the massive stockpiles of raw steel, and the extensive rail networks, and saw only dormant capital waiting to be violently extracted. The corporate philosophy shifted overnight from creation to aggressive liquidation. The meatpackers approached the locomotive business with the exact same ruthless, dispassionate efficiency they applied to a slaughterhouse: trim the fat, isolate the immediately profitable cuts, and discard the rest. Research and development budgets for the struggling diesel line, the only potential path to the future, were slashed to the bone. Essential, routine maintenance on the colossal factory roofs and heavy bridge cranes was indefinitely deferred to make the quarterly balance sheets look artificially healthier. The overarching strategy was no longer to conquer the General Motors monopoly, but to aggressively harvest whatever residual value remained in the Baldwin name before the entire enterprise inevitably collapsed. The consequences of this financial cannibalism quickly manifested physically across the Eddystone landscape, transforming a monument of progress into a sprawling architecture of decay. The factory, which had once felt like a living, breathing organism, a vibrant city-state humming with the violent, beautiful purpose of creation, began to visibly rot. Broken windows in the cavernous erecting shops were left unpatched, allowing the cold, biting winds off the Delaware River to sweep through cavernous workspaces where 1,000-degree crucibles had once glowed like captured suns. The 30 miles of internal railway tracks, which had been polished to a silver sheen by the constant, heavy friction of iron wheels, began to surrender to creeping rust and invasive wild weeds. Nature was slowly beginning to reclaim the empire that men had so arrogantly carved from the mud half a century prior. Yet the human toll was far more devastating than the crumbling brickwork and rusting iron. The new management instituted waves of brutal, calculated layoffs, treating the legendary workforce not as repositories of irreplaceable institutional knowledge, but as an expendable, burdensome operating expense. Foremen who had devoted their entire adult lives to mastering the Baldwin way were summarily dismissed by young, impeccably dressed accountants, men who had never once stepped onto the factory floor, never felt the earth shake beneath a drop forge, or tasted the sulfurous tang of an active foundry. A profound, melancholic lethargy infected the remaining workers, moving through the cavernous shops like phantoms of a forgotten age. The poetic, thunderous rhythm of the hammers, the very heartbeat of their industrial lives, and the pride of their community, had been replaced by the quiet, terrifying scratching of administrative pens and the cold click of typewriters. There was a grim, shared understanding among the men on the floor that they were no longer building the future. They were simply hired mourners presiding over a prolonged corporate funeral. They watched in silent, impotent fury as entire manufacturing divisions were shut down, the heavy, bespoke machinery unceremoniously ripped from its concrete moorings and auctioned off to scrap dealers or shipped to foreign competitors for pennies on the dollar. In a desperate, undignified bid to satisfy their shareholders and stave off the inevitable, the executives began to literally sell the ground out from under the factory. Parcels of the historic 600-acre site were partitioned off and leased to random, unrelated businesses. The unified sovereign empire of Eddystone was being slowly carved into pieces, a titan being fed to the wolves of Wall Street 1 acre at a time. The tragic, inescapable irony was absolute. The visionary leadership of Baldwin had originally fled the crowded confines of Broad Street precisely to secure the vast, unlimited space needed to build an empire without boundaries. Now trapped by their own historic hubris, paralyzed by a changing world, and bleeding capital from 1,000 self-inflicted wounds, they were selling off their promised land just to keep the lights on for another quarter. The great mechanical behemoth was not merely dying. It was actively consuming its own flesh to survive a little longer in a world that had thoroughly and permanently abandoned it. The final decree did not arrive with the thunderous roar of a catastrophic failure, but with the quiet, sterile finality of a typed memorandum. The corporate executioners at Armour & Company had run their ultimate calculations, squeezed the last viable drops of equity from the struggling diesel lines, and determined that the colossal complex on the Delaware River had outlived its financial usefulness. There would be no more desperate mergers, no more frantic restructuring, and no more grand promises of a modern revival. The mandate was absolute. The great mechanical heart of Eddystone was to be permanently stopped. In the agonizing months leading up to the final shutdown, the sprawling 600-acre site transformed from a faltering workplace into an industrial purgatory. The workforce had been systematically decimated by successive waves of layoffs, leaving only a skeletal crew of veteran workers. These remaining men were not retained to build locomotives. They were kept on the payroll to serve as the undertakers for their own livelihoods. Their grueling, heartbreaking task was to dismantle the very empire they had spent their entire lives constructing. The atmosphere inside the cavernous erecting shops was suffocating. The towering spaces, designed to house tens of thousands of men, and the deafening cacophony of heavy manufacturing were now eerily vacant. The voices of the few remaining workers echoed off the cold brick walls, swallowed by the immense empty bays. To walk the floor was to traverse a graveyard of American industry. Everywhere the men looked, the architecture of their pride was being tagged for liquidation. Impeccably dressed auctioneers moved through the grime of the foundries, tying bright paper tags to giant drop forges, heavy stamping presses, and intricate milling machines. These were the very tools that had forged the engines of the First World War and the Sherman tanks of the Second. Now, they bore lot numbers, waiting to be sold for a fraction of their value to scrap dealers or rival manufacturers. For the skeleton crew, the physical labor of tearing down the factory was nothing compared to the psychological toll. Disconnecting a colossal bridge crane or unbolting a multi-ton lathe from its concrete foundation felt like an act of betrayal. These men were intimately familiar with the quirks and rhythms of every machine in the plant. They knew how to coax perfection out of aging steel. Taking a cutting torch to the infrastructure they had meticulously maintained for decades was a brutal, daily humiliation. As the inventory shrank, so did the footprint of the plant. Building by building, the power was cut. The massive electrical breakers were thrown, plunging sections of the factory that had been brightly lit for half a century into permanent darkness. The sprawling network of internal railway tracks was systematically ripped from the ground, severing the vital arteries that had once connected the foundries to the docks. Eddystone was not just closing. It was being meticulously erased from the earth. The men worked in a heavy collective silence, acutely aware that with every bolt they loosened, they were dismantling their own history, their community's foundation, and the legacy of Matthias Baldwin. When the actual day of closure finally arrived, the weather seemed to mirror the somber reality on the ground. It was a cold, overcast morning, devoid of the fiery sun that had once baked the tin roofs of the boiler shops. The men arrived for their final shift knowing there was no actual production left to do. The remaining tasks were purely ceremonial acts of termination. The most visceral death throes of the plant occurred deep within the central power station. For decades, this massive facility had burned mountains of coal, generating the astronomical steam pressure and electrical current required to animate the 600-acre Leviathan. Now the chief engineer stood before the main control panels and began the irreversible sequence of shutting the beast down. The fuel lines were shut tight. The massive, roaring fires in the boiler bellies, which had burned continuously through 2 world wars and the Great Depression, were allowed to slowly consume their remaining fuel and die out. As the internal temperatures plummeted, the immense steam pressure that coursed through the factory's overhead pipes began to bleed away. To the seasoned workers standing on the floor, the sound of the dropping pressure was haunting, a long, drawn-out exhalation, like a giant taking its final, rattling breath. Then came the moment that would be burned into the memory of Delaware County forever. For generations, the great steam whistles of Eddystone had dictated the rhythm of life for miles around. They had signaled the start of the workday, the lunch hour, and the shift changes, serving as the unquestioned timekeepers for thousands of families. On this final afternoon, the plant manager pulled the heavy iron chain one last time. Because the boiler pressure was already fading, the whistle did not emit its traditional ear-splitting shriek. Instead, it produced a low, mournful, hollow wail that echoed weakly across the gray waters of the Delaware River. It was a devastating, acoustic symbol of a dying era. The sound hung in the air, a final lament for the kings of steam before dissolving entirely into the wind. With the factory officially dead, the final procession began. Hundreds of men, their faces etched with decades of hard labor and sudden, profound uncertainty, walked toward the main gates. They carried heavy, scuffed wooden toolboxes, the physical repositories of their specific, now obsolete skills. Many of these boxes contained specialized calipers and wrenches that had been handed down from fathers to sons, tools that belonged to a mechanical world that no longer existed. There was no grand ceremony, no speeches from executives, and no marching bands. The men simply filed out in a heavy, unbroken silence. They did not look at the corporate liquidators holding clipboards by the exits. They looked at the ground, or cast one final lingering glance back at the dark, towering silhouettes of the erecting shops. As the last man stepped over the threshold, the heavy iron gates of Eddystone were pulled shut. The thick steel chains were wrapped around the bars, and the heavy padlocks snapped closed with a brutal, metallic finality. Outside the gates, the local taverns filled quickly, but there was no boisterous shouting, no clinking of glasses in celebration of a hard day's work. Men sat over their beers in a state of collective shock, mourning the sudden evaporation of their identities. Inside the fence, a profound, unnatural silence settled over the 600 acres. The deafening symphony of American industry, the proud, violent roar that had conquered continents and shaped the 20th century, had been permanently extinguished. The silence following the closure of the Eddystone plant was not a peaceful rest. It was the deafening quiet of a sudden, unnatural death. For Delaware County, the loss of the Baldwin Locomotive Works was a trauma that rippled through the local economy and the collective psyche. The sprawling 600-acre complex, once the very epicenter of American industrial might, quickly became a colossal, decaying monument to corporate hubris. In the years immediately following 1956, the site did not experience a renaissance or a clever commercial repurposing. Instead, it became the victim of scavengers. The physical dismantling of the Leviathan was a grueling, years-long spectacle. Demolition crews and scrappers descended upon the historic acreage like vultures, picking clean the bones of a fallen giant. The cavernous erecting shops, structures so vast they once had their own internal weather systems, were unceremoniously torn open by wrecking balls. Millions of bricks, laid by hand at the dawn of the 20th century to house the fires of progress, were crushed into dust. The sprawling subterranean network of heavy foundations, poured deep into the marshland to withstand the earth-shattering impact of massive drop forges, proved too costly to excavate and was simply buried beneath the rubble. The Delaware River docks, where thousands of steam locomotives had once been hoisted onto ocean freighters bound for every continent on Earth, slowly rotted and slipped into the dark water. The intricate 30-mile nervous system of internal railway tracks was ripped from the mud and sold off for its raw metallic value. What had taken half a century, millions of dollars, and the sweat of tens of thousands of men to build was erased in a fraction of the time by the cold, calculating mathematics of corporate liquidation. As the physical structures vanished, so too did the rich, localized culture of heavy metallurgy that had defined the surrounding communities. The master boilermakers, the expert riveters, and the seasoned foundry men, artisans who had spent their lives perfecting a singular, magnificent craft, found themselves adrift in a rapidly changing world. The loss transformed Eddystone from a proud, sovereign industrial city-state into just another early casualty of the emerging American Rust Belt. Some workers managed to secure jobs in nearby shipyards or refineries, but many were forced into early, bitter retirements or relegated to lower-paying, unskilled labor. The proud, multi-generational tradition of building the big ones at Baldwin was severed forever. By the late 20th century, the once mighty Eddystone site had been reduced to a patchwork of generic industrial parks, a power-generating station, and vast, empty tracts of brownfield land. If you stand on those shores today and listen to the wind coming off the Delaware River, there is no echo of the deafening, triumphant roar that once shook the earth. There is only the hum of passing highway traffic and the quiet rustle of wild weeds pushing through cracked asphalt. The tragedy of the Baldwin Locomotive Works at Eddystone is not simply that a company failed. Businesses fail every day. The profound lesson of Eddystone lies in how it failed. It was not defeated by a foreign adversary, a sudden lack of capital, or a dramatic shift in global trade. The undisputed king of steam was destroyed by its own blinding success. The executives in their mahogany-paneled offices had constructed an echo chamber where their legendary history blinded them to the approaching future. They fell so deeply in love with the magnificent machines they created that they forgot the fundamental rule of industry. A company's ultimate loyalty must be to progress, not to its product. They believed they were in the business of building steam locomotives, failing to realize that the world only cared about the efficient movement of freight. When the definition of power changed from fire and water to diesel and electricity, the giant was too proud, too rigid, and too heavily invested in its own past to adapt. The empty acres of Eddystone serve as a permanent, haunting reminder that in the unforgiving arena of technological evolution, No amount of history, size, or past glory can save an empire that refuses to change its mind. The story of Baldwin's Eddystone plant is more than just a tragic footnote in the grand ledger of American industrial history. It is a profound, cautionary tale about the blinding nature of unchecked success. For over a century, the men of Eddystone believed they were forging the absolute pinnacle of human engineering. They built magnificent, fire-breathing machines that conquered untamed frontiers, moved oceans of freight, and helped secure the survival of the free world. Their immense pride was entirely justified, but it also proved to be fatal. They fell into the ultimate corporate trap. They fell in love with their product instead of remaining devoted to the fundamental purpose it served. They forgot that the world did not inherently owe loyalty to the romance of steam, no matter how beautifully or powerfully it was harnessed. When the paradigm shifted, when the cold, standardized efficiency of the diesel-electric engine rendered their fiery art obsolete, they were too heavily invested in their own legend to adapt. They chose the comfort of tradition over the painful, necessary mechanics of evolution. In doing so, they doomed a 600-acre empire and shattered the multi-generational livelihoods of thousands. Today, as we stand on the precipice of new, sweeping technological revolutions, the silent ghosts of Eddystone offer a stark and necessary warning. No giant is too big to fall. No historical legacy is an adequate substitute for continuous innovation. The moment a company or a society begins to believe that its current mastery is permanent, the countdown to its obsolescence has already begun. The true cost of progress is not measured merely in what we must build, but in our willingness to recognize what we must leave behind. If you found value in this journey through the rise and fall of the Baldwin Locomotive Works, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What modern industrial giant do you think is currently making the same mistakes Baldwin did? Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next chapter of industrial history.